Fate was bullied every day until he awakened the true power of his SS rank skill. Fate is your typical disgusting loser with the job of holding a flag post in front of the castle walls. He's been there the whole day and complains about how starving he is feeling right now. He then notices a group of 4 adventurers passing nearby. One of them brags about hitting level 6 while doing their hunt a few hours ago. But that only made Fate jealous. Despite that feeling, he knows he won't ever be able to be an adventurer. His stomach starts growling again, and he thinks he is useless. He's hungry, he has a stupid job, and his unique skill is worthless. Let's be fair, his stats are all 1, and his skill is gluttony. Luckily, his shift is almost over, until the trio arrives. The leader of the trio then drops a few coins on the floor as payment and tells Fate to pick it up. Fate complies and slowly starts picking the coins. Yet, one of the holy knights steps on his hand. He starts insulting Fate, saying that he is so filthy that he didn't notice him. And as you expect, Fate is a bullied person who has no way to fight back. His stomach makes noise again, making the leader of the trio mad. The guy kicks Fate a few more times, and the girl joins in. She starts calling Fate's skill useless and says that he only survives because they give him money. Fate explains that in this world, everyone's worth depends on the special powers they got from gods. They call them skills. The trio leader then orders Fate to get up. But when he tries, the other guy steps on his face and asks him to hurry up. They increase their bullying, claiming that he needs to be disciplined for failing to comply with orders. However, a voice from afar tells them to stop. This is the famous Lady Roxy Hart. She complains in her elegant way that holy knights shouldn't abuse the people they swore to protect. The leader claims it's also his duty to provide employment to useless people like Fate. She then asks why he is treating Fate like that. The guy twists her words and tells the others they will be leaving. Roxy walks toward Fate and asks if he's okay while trying to get him up. She uses her handkerchief to clean up his injuries, but Fate notices the way the trio's leader is looking at Roxy. She finishes cleaning him up and he thanks her for her help. Later at night, Fate is in the bar thinking about Roxy's words, but Fate knows that the trio might take revenge on her, so he decides to not involve her in this thing. The bar owner comes to him and asks if the trio did the same as usual. He tells Fate if this keeps up, he will end up like the last guy. Fate walks on the streets and his stomach is making noise again. Turns out his skill allows him to be always hungry. He calls that skill stupid and wishes he could have been born with something more useful. Fate then suddenly stops and notices some thieves climbing up the walls. He starts running back to alert Roxy about the situation, and she heads inside. Fate hears blades clashing and screams until they suddenly stop. He then sees from the distance an injured thief. He decides to confront the thief head-on and uses the spear pole to send him to the next life. Suddenly, everything around Fate starts to get dark. He hears a voice saying that his gluttony skill has been activated and that his stats are being updated. When he checks them, he sees that every single one is over 100. He also gained 2 new skills, Identify and Telepathy. He doesn't understand what just happened. Roxy then comes running toward him to check if he got hurt by the thief. She notices that he doesn't look well, and she is worried. She never said that, but Fate managed to read her thoughts. She decides to thank him for helping her succeed in her duty and asks if he would like to work for her family. Fate starts to consider the situation. Does he want to continue being treated like trash? Or does he want to have a bright future by working for Roxy? In the end, he agrees to work for her. He heads back home and is still confused by his status changes. He doesn't know what his new skills are, but thinks that telepathy is what allowed him to hear Roxy's thoughts. He then starts to worry about his gluttony skill activation and what's going on with his body. But he quickly brushes it off because he can now beat monsters. The next day, Fate goes to the shopping street and starts looking for a weapon. However, his budget is only 2 coins. He decides to check the blades and uses his Identify skill to check every single blade. Suddenly, the swords start talking. Fate starts to panic but tries to not make a scene. His skill allows him to know the name of the sword, Greed. The sword then tells him that if Fate buys it, the sword will make him stronger. The sword then calls him Gluttony. Fate is confused about how the sword knows. The sword explains they have a lot in common. Fate then makes his decision and buys the sword. Meanwhile, the trio is complaining because Roxy is trying to hire Fate without asking them. The girl continues to complain about Roxy, but the guy explains that Roxy's family and theirs are part of the Great 5 families that support the kingdom. So, acting against her will raise some problems. Meanwhile, Fate goes to the outskirts of the city with his new sword. The sword then says that enemies come, and Fate starts to panic. A goblin jumps on him, but Fate's eyes change, and he slices the goblin in one slash. The other voice speaks again, explaining that gluttony was activated and will increase his stats. He also gained the strength boost skill. Fate is confused that this happened again, but there are more goblins around. They all dash to attack Fate, but he manages to parry and slice them one after one. His gluttony skill keeps activating every time he defeats a goblin. A few hours later, Fate finally manages to defeat hundreds of goblins. He now has a few more skills, but his stats are now crazy. His lowest stat is nearly 500, and his strength is triple of that. Greed then asks if Fate stopped being hungry. Fate is initially confused, but he realizes that his stomach never made noise today. Fate then asks Greed what this is all about. Greed explains it's all because of gluttony. Normally, people must fight and win battles to increase their stats or level up. However, gluttony is a cheat skill. It steals the stats and skills of whatever he defeats. The only problem is that he cannot get experience and level up. Fate asks how Greed knows about it, and the sword explains they're the same. Despite being confused, Fate notices the adventurers group coming in his direction. Greed tells him that he shouldn't let people know about his gluttony skill because it defies the divine law. Fate realizes what this means and decides that he cannot party up. He must always fight alone. Greed then tells him that he's not alone, because Greed is with him. Fate accepts those words and decides to return. Yet, Greed stops him from returning without collecting the goblin's ears. Fate is confused, but Greed explains that he will get paid if he sells them. He managed to earn 3 silver and 80 bronze coins and decided to get some meat for dinner. But he bumps into a shady guy coming from a dark alley. There's a little girl with the shady guy. She touches Fate, and he hears her voice begging for his help. Fate then uses his skill to identify the shady guy's skills, however it quickly disappears. Greed explains the guy has a conceal ability, which hides everything from identify. Greed asks what Fate will do, and he reveals that he will save the girl. The girl ends up in a warehouse, chained against the wall. The guy starts mocking her, telling that she will become a toy for the Holy Knights. Fate is watching closely, but Greed stops him from moving. Greed explains that Guy is stronger than him and that he should turn away. But Fate wants to help anyone he sees suffering in front of him, especially because he now has the power to do it. The guy stops and starts walking away, giving the girl a chance to sob. She then hears some footsteps, but it's Fate telling her she will be alright. He frees her from the chains and tells her to hurry up and escape. However, the other guy has returned. The guy explains he sometimes runs into guys like Fate, pathetic, useless dudes who think they're some sort of hero of justice. Fate simply smiles at the girl and pulls out Greed to fight the bad guy. Greed has an idea and tells Fate to back away because the other guy thinks Fate is weaker than himself. Therefore, Greed wants Fate to take advantage of the guy's confidence. Fate follows the instructions and starts running away with the girl. Fate manages to reach the endpoint, and Greed tells him it's now the time to attack. Fate then knocks the boxes where the other guy is passing by and uses them to jump and attack him. The guy manages to dodge, only taking a scratch on his cheek. The guy then starts to get serious, and his sword starts to glow. Greed knows that skill will be a problem and tells Fate to strike the guy down through his weapon. Fate uses the boxes again to leap toward the guy and manages to not only cut his sword in half but also slice the guy up. While the guy is still alive, Fate asks what he meant about bringing the girl to the Holy Knights. He questions who ordered the guy to kidnap the girl. After some seconds, the guy agrees to reveal who hired him. It was Otto Vileric, the guy who randomly used to beat Fate. Turns out the guy is a crazy dude who likes to show orphan kids some archery skills. But instead of shooting apples, he's shooting brains. Fate then takes the girl outside, telling her she will be fine from now on. He then takes her back to the orphanage, where she reunites with the nuns. They thank Fate for helping Sahara. He then walks away, and Greed explains that not only his stats increased, but he also got the one-handed sword technique. He congratulates Fate for his new skill, but Fate is confused. Greed explains this is a technical skill that allows him to get tech arts. They're literally secret techniques. In this case, he can attack twice at the same time. Greed then asks about tomorrow, since it will be Fate's first day working for the Hearts. Fate confirms, and Greed asks if he's going to show up looking like a pleb. This reminds Fate that he forgot to buy new clothes. Meanwhile, in a bar, there's an old man revealing the news that Sir Mason was struck down by a divine dragon in Galia. The barman asks what will happen to the Hart family, and the old man replies that Roxy will succeed him. The main problem is that Sir Mason was keeping the Holy Knights in check, if you can call it that, and the old man isn't sure she can keep them in line. The next day, Fate arrives at the Holy Knight district, looking fresh. He ends up meeting her by the fountain, and she smiles, explaining she was waiting for him. However, Fate doesn't reply. He's smitten by her beauty. He tells her she's pretty and she gets shy. She then takes him inside on a tour, and her first stop is in front of a grave. Turns out this is her father, and she's introducing Fate to him. Fate is initially confused. She explains it happened 5 days ago when he met a divine dragon. She explains that it was her family's duty to contain the monsters this year. Despite being a dangerous task, it shouldn't be deadly. Still, a divine dragon that had been missing for 1,000 years suddenly appeared, and her father went to another world. The maid chef, Haru, appears. Roxy introduces the two to each other, and she immediately starts threatening Fate, telling him to behave like a proper servant. Turns out, Fate is later tasked with trimming the bushes every day. Haru then appears, explaining that Roxy wants to see him. He follows Haru but finds it weird about his stomach situation. Haru takes him to another part of the garden, where he meets Roxy. She gives him some tea and asks how he's been adapting to his job. But Fate is only thinking about his stomach. He's feeling even hungrier every second. Suddenly, he starts to feel dizzy and collapses. He wakes up in his room at night and reads a note. It's from Roxy, asking him to take a day off and rest. Fate decides to ask Greed why he's feeling hungrier. Greed explains that once the gluttony skill gets a taste of souls, it cannot be stopped. Fate is confused, but Greed explains the more he devours, the stronger he will get. But that will also make him want to devour more and more. By activating his skill, he will be destined to hunt and devour souls until his last day alive. Fate asks what will happen if he doesn't. Greed explains there's only two possibilities. He will either starve to death, or he will lose control and go on a rampage, putting everyone in danger. Fate is shocked because that will make him a monster. Greed then gives him some advice. When Fate's hunger approaches its limits, it will be visible in his eyes. Fate then checks his reflection in the mirror and finds out he has a Sharingan from Wish. Without any option, Fate decides to head out of the city at night to hunt. Fate finally manages to find a group of goblins, and notices that his skill made them stop moving. He slices through the goblins with ease and smiles like a maniac. However, small goblins aren't enough to satisfy him. Greed tells him to head over to the hobgoblin forest. He follows those instructions and he meets some hobgoblins. He starts slicing them up, but it's never enough to free him from his hunger. After a huge hunt, he finally manages to stop feeling hungry. He doesn't want to feel like this again. Greed tells him that he must hunt monsters from time to time. Suddenly, the ground starts shaking. Fate hides and notices a huge monster carrying a human in hand. Greed explains this is a goblin king. Fate's eyes immediately change, and Greed explains they have similar stats, but the goblin has health regeneration. Greed explains it heals the wounds, enabling it to fight for a long period of time. The Goblin King sits down and enjoys his human dessert. This gives Fate the opportunity to climb a tree and strike the Goblin King's arm. However, Fate gets distracted to see the human dessert laying on the ground. The monster tries to smash him, but Fate manages to dodge its hits. He's clearly afraid of the attacks, but Greed tells him to trust him and rush in. Fate follows and manages to not only block the monster's attacks but also slice him down. The gluttony skill activates again, making Fate reach a whole new level. He now has several skills, and all his starts reach 5 digits. He then sits down, exhausted, and Greed says that the real deal will begin now. He explains that Fate's stats can now use Greed's first level. Fate is confused, but Greed says it's another form. Greed explains that he can get new functions if Fate offers him his stats, but that will cost every single stat point. Fate refuses, but Greed explains that if he doesn't, he won't be able to use him anymore. He then says that Fate can either be strong by himself, or he can make him Greed strong, and they work together. Fate decides to accept the deal and gives him his stats. Greed then starts transforming into a magic bow. He just needs to draw the bow and the arrow will appear. Fate decides to test it, and turns out the arrow can track the target, easily defeating a goblin that was nearby. He then decides to take the Goblin King's ears and drops them at Saraha's orphanage. The next day, Roxy tries to sneak out of the house. Fate doesn't recognize her and tells her to stop moving, thinking she is a thief. She gets a jump scare and turns around. Fate apologizes for scaring her, mentioning she looks different than usual. He asks if she is heading to the castle, but she simply replies that she will go into town on a secret inspection. Roxy then decides to make it a date in her head. She tells him that Fate will escort her during the inspection. The two head off, but Roxy seems to be having too much fun. He tells her to slow down, but she tells him to stop calling her Roxy, otherwise, people will notice her. She then asks him to call her Lexi. They leave the alleyway and step into the city streets. It's filled with life, merchants, and all kinds of people. He notices that she stopped by a stall and sees her looking at a red gem. She explains that she's interested in them because she's a girl. She then notices some sort of rocks and asks the merchant if those are also gems. The merchant explains that's ore, it can have a gem inside or not. Fate then tries to look at the rocks until he notices Roxy simply looking at a blue gem. He realizes that she seems like a normal girl instead of a holy knight. The merchant takes advantage of the moment, proposing a discount if Fate buys the gem to his girl. Fate gets shy, and Roxy decides to simply walk away. He follows her, and she asks if Fate has any warrior acquaintance. Fate asks about Minerva and Oliver, but Roxy explains she needs to talk to active warriors, not retired ones. He gets curious, but they're interrupted when they hear a conversation about the Goblin Massacre. Turns out people think it was a high-level monster who did it. Roxy then starts chasing the two guys who were talking about it. One of them thinks the monster theory is stupid because the Goblin King ears were donated to an orphanage. Roxy then interrupts the guys and asks about the details. She asks if they know anything about the roaming monster, but they don't and walk away. She then asks Fate to take her to where the warriors gather. He takes her to the bar and the barman, who thought Fate was dead, is surprised to see him alive. He introduces Roxy as his co-worker, but the barman starts picking him up, mentioning that he disappeared for a while and now brings his girl. Roxy reacts by destroying her cup, not because she's angry, but because that's what she wants, to be clapped. They have a huge meal, and the barman explains what he knows about the mysterious goblin wiper. She thinks it's a wandering monster that has migrated from another region. The barman explains that will be bad for business, making Fate confused. The barman goes into detail, saying that people must pass through the Goblin Plains if they want to do business in or out of the city. Therefore, people won't want to travel and it will destroy the city's economy. Fate starts realizing his mistake when an old man gets inside the bar. He thinks he's seeing a ghost because he also thought that Fate was dead. Turns out the old man also has some information. They think the roaming monster is a lick. Therefore, the Holy Knights will be taking direct action to deal with it. Fate then gets curious and asks why she didn't know about the hunt. She explains that since her father passed away, the Villeric family is literally using the situation to deal with stuff without informing her. Suddenly, they hear two voices and check the commotion. They notice that Hato is pulling a kid's arm and Roxy tells him to release the kid. The girl claims they're just taking a lost kid into their protection, but Roxy orders Fate to help the kid. While doing it, the trio leader tries to talk to Fate, but our boy ignores him. Roxy then tells the trio she will be taking care of the kid and decides to question the leader. She asks why he didn't inform her about the wandering monster hunt, but the guy just ignores her and walks away. The kid then reveals he hates Holy Knights, making Roxy apologize. He's confused, but Fate quickly asks if he got lost from his mother. The kid confirms, leading Fate and Roxy to help him look for his mother. Fate thinks that he also got lost when he arrived in the city 5 years ago. However, he was helped by a female Holy Knight. He wonders what happened to her because he has never seen her around since then. But we can clearly notice it was Roxy when she had short hair. After walking around for some hours, they still cannot find the kid's mother. However, she appears sometime later looking for her son. Fate is happy they managed to find her, and he gets enchanted when he sees Roxy's pure smile. She why he's staring at her, and he tries to make an excuse. He says that it's getting late and they need to return. Roxy then realizes the situation and makes him promise her one thing. If they get in trouble, they will do it together. He promises they will and they rush home, just to get scolded by the head maid. Later at night, Fate asks Greed if there's a way to hunt monsters without Roxy finding out. Greed suggests he gets a special mask. Greed explains that the mask will make him look different to whoever sees him. Fate thinks that's perfect and buys it. Meanwhile, the Holy Knights are having a meeting without Roxy's consent, where the trio's leader claims they will discuss their excursion to Galia. At the Hart family castle, Fate is casually pruning flowers. Leading a double life is really telling on him. Lady Roxy approaches him, telling him she has a secret mission for him. He asks her if it's going to be another inspection. Next, we can see Fate in Lady Roxy's carriage. The carriage finally arrives at its destination and Aisha Hart, who is Roxy's mother, comes out to greet them. Roxy's mother asks her who accompanied her. She introduces Fate to her mother as a servant she hired. They exchange pleasantries. Greed tells Fate he's relieved Aisha is nice. Aisha tells Fate to come closer. She asks him if he likes her daughter. Roxy is embarrassed by this question. She questions her mother, wondering why she asked Fate such a question. Aisha tells her she just wants to know his opinion about her as his employer. They are both relieved she means the business-wise relationship. Fate tells Aisha in all sincerity that he cares for Roxy and would serve her all his life if allowed. Roxy is embarrassed once again and rushes off to her room in a bid to hide it. Aisha tells him she can't believe her daughter turned out to be a holy knight. She tells him she worries Roxy is pushing herself too hard now that she's the head after her father passed. Fate tells her Roxy is a good holy knight who performs her duty well and is loved by the people. Aisha is happy to hear this. At the vineyard, Fate joins other servants to harvest grapes. One of the servants offers him a cup of freshly juiced grapes. Fate thanks him. He takes a sip and compliments its sweetness. The servant explains how the lords and servants have worked together to make the grapes have such great flavor. Fate asks if Sir Mason also had a hand in this. The servant tells him he heard the sad news of his passing. He tells Fate they weren't sure Roxy would come around for the harvest because of that. He asks the servant if Roxy helped with the yearly harvest. He tells Fate that's one of the things she comes for, the other is hunting monsters. Fate asks about the monster hunting part. The servant tells him the current harvest time is not just for grapes but several food stuff. He tells Fate the monsters show up because they are usually hungry.